Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. Psalms 127 verse 1 to 2. To build our marriages on Christ, we need to live by the marriage principles God has given us in His Word. One of those principles directs husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church, and simultaneously, wives are to submit to their husbands. If you want to get into a heated debate with Christian women, bring up the word submission. Amongst the responses, there will be opinions on what submission means, whether it's still relevant in today's society, and a variety of practical scenarios which make it almost impossible to even think about submission. For women, submission is not something that comes naturally, but with Christ as our help, it is possible to live by His principles and obediently submit to our husbands. Although the Bible was written in a certain place over a period of time, it represents unchanging truth that calls and equips us to be servants of God in every area of our lives, including our marriages. Submission is about power, not weakness, as many people may think it is. To demonstrate, I will share with you examples from the Bible. King Solomon warned his son that a woman wields great power by way of her words, her attitude, and her sexuality. King Solomon acknowledged this when he penned Proverbs 14 verse 1. A wise woman builds her home, but a foolish woman tears it down with her own hands. A wife's power can be used to either build or to tear down. From Samson, the strongest man that ever lived, to King Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, and King David, one of the godliest men that ever lived, they were all compromised by the power of women. In these situations, feminine power was used for harm. However, God designed it to be directed for great good. One may ask, what is submission anyway? Submission is properly interpreted as a wife's voluntary and respectful support of her husband's leadership role within a marriage. Here are a few points on what a wife's submission in marriage means from a Christian perspective and how it can be applied practically. Number 1, biblical foundation. Submission in a Christian marriage is rooted in biblical teachings, particularly Ephesians 5 verse 22 to 24, which states, "Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as to the Lord." Now let's go back to the very beginning, after Adam and Eve sinned. One of the punishments that has befallen all women is labor pains. Genesis 3 verse 16 says, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to your children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." Part of the husband ruling over the wife is allowing him to be the head of the home. This submission is considered an expression of reverence for God's design for marriage and a reflection of the relationship between Christ and the church. Just as the church is called to submit to Christ, wives are encouraged to submit to their husbands in all things. Number 2, a voluntary and respectful attitude. Submission is not about coercion or forced obedience that feels like a burden. It's a voluntary attitude that a wife willingly embraces out of love and respect for her husband and her faith. It involves recognizing and honoring her husband's leadership role without diminishing her own value or worth. This respectful attitude does not imply blind obedience, but rather an acknowledgement of her husband's responsibility to lead and make decisions for the family, seeking to align them with God's will. A submissive wife communicates openly and honestly with her husband, sharing her perspectives, feelings, and desires. She does so by firstly praying for wisdom, then speaking in a spirit of humility and respect. seeking to work together with her husband to make decisions that honor God and benefit the family, without speaking from a place of pride to show she knows better than him. God has given her, in her role as a wife, a calling to be her husband's suitable helper. Number 3, ask him for help. Another way of being submissive as a wife is learning to ask your husband for help. This is hard, especially when you're used to doing things by yourself. It's also difficult when you've built walls to protect yourself from being hurt. You want to do everything possible to make sure you do not feel rejected. One of the hardest things for wives to process, whilst being one of the most important things needed in marriage, is to make their husbands feel loved, feel useful, and feel needed by their wives. Therefore, a wife asking for help allows her husband to feel valued. Number 4, do not compete with him. Although you are a successful independent woman, do not try to compete with your husband or compare your achievements to his. This is something that has led to the destruction of many marriages. By competing, you undermine his headship. One key area that you should not compete in, i.e., boast and rub it in his face, is how much you each earn. Know which hat to wear and where to wear it. At work, show up like a boss, but once you step into your home, be a wife. No man wants to be disrespected, or worse, in the middle of an argument, be reminded who you are, your job title, and list of qualifications. The good book tells us that a silent answer turns away wrath. Whether he admits it or not, most men feel less than a man if they are not the breadwinners. It's no fault of the man. It's literally in his DNA to provide and protect. Even if you don't agree, it's so much easier to avoid competition in financial matters. His achievements and your achievements are both your achievements. You're on the same team. Celebrate each other and always show up as one. In marriage, you can have healthy competition in other aspects, but because money is one of the major causes of divorce, do yourself a favor and leave this competition out of your marriage. Number 5, let your husband provide. Men are programmed to want to provide for the women they love. He's the provider and the protector. You can be submissive by letting him play his role for you to the best of his ability. Let him provide material things and intangibles such as protection and reassurance. It is good to help him provide for the family. However, only do so when he wants your help. Even if you earn more than your husband, it's important to let your husband stay in his role by providing for you. Pray for his hands, praying that God blesses the work of his hands. Pray for his friends, praying that God connects him with God-fearing friends and influences. Pray for his spiritual life so that he may also be submissive to God. Pray for generational blessings for your children and generations to come. Pray against generational curses and protection of your husband and children. A lot of times the Holy Spirit will prompt you to pray. Do not ignore that voice because it is a blessing to cover your husband in prayer. When God prompts you to pray, that's when your husband needs prayer the most. Lastly, as you have heard these tips for today, you may have thought to yourself, why do I have to do all the work and he does nothing? This is not a competition on who's better than the other. It's about fulfilling your God-ordained role in marriage. You do these things not because your husband is perfect, but because this is what God asks of you as a wife. You do it because marriage is about serving without keeping tabs. 1 Corinthians 13 says, "Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast. It is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrong. All things are possible through God." And as God speaks to you, he will also speak to your husband in his own way. Remember, unless the Lord builds, those who labor in vain. A wise woman builds her home, but a foolish woman tears it down with her own hands. Proverbs 14 verse 1. The choice is yours.